The competitive 40K network presents Art of War. Art of War. Strategy and tactics. Discussions with the best players on the planet. Now your host, Nick Nanavati.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another super exciting Art of War 40K podcast. This week we have a very special guest, the winner of the Warzone Atlanta and return Art of War All-Star, John Lennon. John, how are you doing?
I'm great. Always good to be back on the show. You know, sometimes I miss talking to our audience here.
That's wonderful. The audience misses you, and they're definitely going to miss hearing your insights after your latest win with Space Marines, but not Space Marine Gladius, which everyone has been talking about. This one is the Stormlance. And John, if I recall, you had no Thunderwolves in your army.
Absolutely not. I stuck true to the boys in blue. I still brought Ultramarines. I think that is the way to go right now. But I decided to change things up, and I took the Stormlance Strike Force, which is not something you see as often right now.
No, it's really not. And I think it's always really nice to see someone who's like a return top competitor doing innovations on what a lot of people assume is a solved army. And with the meta shaking up as often as it is, it's lovely to see these kinds of innovations. That's what we're going to be talking about in part one. We're going to go through John's army list. We're going to go through how he developed it, his tactics, his strategies, his approach to the game, how he plays the mission, stratagems, all that good stuff. And then in part two, which of course is available for our patrons, that's where we're going to talk about John's actual games. This was a 7-round super major tournament, and John came out on top undefeated. And he also is going to share all those insights with you in part two. You can subscribe right now on patreon.com/AOW40K. You get access to this part two, along with 270 plus other part twos, and access to our Discord server. If you don't want to miss this one, Space Marines are a super popular army. John is one of the best Marine players in the entire world, and he is breaking it down for you here. John, are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm excited.
I'm ready and excited. Let's talk about it. John, tell me about your journey finding this Stormlance. I know WCW was your last big singles event, and you were playing Astra Militarum all the way up to second place podium of one of the biggest Warhammer tournaments in the world. And now you're back at it. You seem to be shifting armies, shifting detachments. What was the thought process here?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, this change came about after we saw that kind of grot misbalance patch where we saw some changes to the game, including some changes to Space Marines. I took Astra Militarum to Worlds because I was feeling a little burnt out on Space Marines after I played them basically nonstop for over 6 months. And it turns out one event was enough of a palate cleanser, and I wanted to go right back to Space Marines by the time that weekend was over. I missed my power armor. So, going right back to Space Marines, I of course wanted to try out Ultramarines in order to take advantage of all the changes that we saw in December, mostly with Oath of Moment and the buffs to Guilliman. Of course, I loved Calgar anyways. These things we all know, and I'm sure everyone loves playing against that. However, I wanted to try to make my list a little bit different from normal. The way that I settled on Stormlance was that I was looking around for something new. I felt like a Space Marine Gladius with +1 to wound was something that I could very easily figure out what it did. I already played Ultramarine Gladius in the past. If I take +1 to wound, add it to the list, take 50 points out of the list to account for some changes, I kind of already know what it is. It's a good army, but it didn't feel like it was one of the best armies to me. It just feels like it's very above average.
What's that distinction in your mind? Like, how do you separate a very above average army from a top army in your mind?
For me, it's all about choices. Truth be told, I think that at high level Warhammer, top player versus top player, of course, this is what's on my mind right after the World Championships, where every game I play is top player against top player. I think that having an army list that gives one pilot more ability to make choices and makes it harder on the opponent really matters more, actually, than the power level of a list. I think once you get to a certain level of you can do damage to most things in the game, and you're playing against another really good player, having more decision points is more important. Gladius is notoriously better than average here, because you have that ability to fall back or advance and charge and shoot and do whatever you want with the doctrine system. I wanted more. And I wanted the better reactive move. And so this entire experiment came around to, boy, I wish my reactive move was better because I'm gosh darn tired of rolling a 1 on my D6 reactive move.
Yeah, so you get that flat 6-inch reactive move with Stormlance, and that was like a key component into making that decision?
100%. Once I got there, I kind of worked backwards. I chose the reactive move. And then I looked and I said, okay, well, this also buffs mounted units and it buffs flying vehicles. Now, how can I take units to support a switch from Gladius to Stormlance?
Yeah, so that's very fascinating for a few reasons, and I love the way you're kind of taking this backwards approach to it. I think a lot of players like assume Gladius is just like the go-to because it is supremely flexible, right? You can advance and charge, advance and shoot, fall back and charge, fall back and shoot, whenever you want, basically, between the infinite CP Guilliman and Calgar give you, and then also the doctrines enabled themselves. You said that a top player is looking for a maximum ability to make choices, and that feels like a lot of choices for me, but you valued the reactive move like more highly than all of that other stuff added together.
Yeah, it's because when you compare Stormlance to Gladius, there's actually a fair amount of overlap. I usually tell people that the playstyle is going to be very similar between Stormlance and Gladius. So just to kind of break it down real fast, Gladius lets you, with your doctrine choices, essentially advance or fall back and shoot and charge at a lot of good points. I won't go too deep into that. You can read the Gladius attachment. It's been around for 2 years. The Stormlance attachment lets you fall back and advance and charge all the time. So you already have Assault Doctrine all the time. And then you get half of Tactical Doctrine all the time. Now you don't get to shoot after doing that, but then there's a stratagem to one command point, advance and shoot, which is often what I would do in Gladius anyways, would spend a CP, put something into Devastator Doctrine, advance and shoot. Well, I can do the same thing in Stormlance. The only thing I'm lacking is fall back and shoot, which in my mind doesn't matter at all on Space Marine Infantry because I don't take any Space Marine Infantry with guns that really matter. And on vehicles, only really matters if you have blast weapons.
Wow. So I understand the comparison. It does feel like your Stormlance list has a lot of overlap and similarities to Gladius and just kind of skews in certain directions. A lot of people view Stormlance traditionally as the White Scars detachment or the Thunderwolves Space Wolf detachment because it buffs your mounted units, and you often see Stormlance accompanied with like maximum Thunderwolves, Wolf jailing you, that's type of style. You're obviously not going for any of that and instead focusing on the other stuff that Stormlance gives you. What spawned that kind of mindset shift in terms of looking at it with a fresh set of eyes and, you know, reevaluating what this detachment can offer you in a different light than what has previously been successful?
Yeah, so a lot of this came together with the fact that I'm a big fan conceptually of land speeders and like the Storm Raven. These are units, Nick, you often get to hear me musing at the workroom table. These are units that I want to be good. Not necessarily units that are good, but they're units that I would like to take in my list if I just got to choose.
You do
and
love
everything
land
was equal.
speeders.
I love land speeders. And a lot of the rules in Stormlance affect flying vehicles or mounted. All of these rules that go on Thundercav are for mounted or vehicles with fly in a lot of cases, or just vehicles that aren't walkers. And so I really wanted to, if I could, I've been trying to find a way to fit these units in lists for a while. They've been getting cheaper and cheaper as the balance patches go on because they have never been particularly competitive, these Storm Speeders. And I've been waiting for their time, and I felt like we were getting there. I felt like we were close, and we now get a damage buff and Oath, which to me solves the big problem that these Hammerstrikes and similars had, where they just didn't do enough damage. But Space Marines just got a big damage glow up. And my problem with Stormlance was always that you got really good tools and you had nothing to increase your damage. There's nothing in Stormlance that makes my datasheets hit harder than the datasheet tells you it does.
And now with buffed Oath, your datasheets just do more damage.
Absolutely. I do not need datasheet buffs anymore.
That makes sense. So it's kind of like the change to Oath didn't encourage you to just play Space Marines like you had been with +1 to wound occasionally. It warranted like a rethinking of how the codex functions.
Exactly. As part of my coaching, working through some clients, I actually found out that a lot of my clients who are switching to Space Marines or playing Space Marines again, because almost everyone has a Space Marine army, right after the Balanced Data Slate were saying like, yeah, I'm playing Gladius, but I'm not really using it. I'm just using the doctrines. I'm like, oh, well, like, what about, like, you're using Lance when you charge? Like, no, I just put Oath on things I'm going to charge. Then I'm +1 to wound. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's true. I guess you don't need that. And I know from my experience that you almost never fight on death in Gladius.
Right.
Just very rarely comes up. Space Marine units usually aren't needed to do that. And I was just kind of going down the Gladius checklist of, well, it's always been my detachment, but maybe I don't need Lance anymore. And I already cut Fire Discipline out when they booted it into the sun. Maybe I don't need to be Gladius anymore. I never want to hold on to my preconceived notions after they've expired.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. And a lot of players, especially players who kind of take some time away from the hobby and come back into it, might be stuck in their ways. But the meta is constantly evolving. So being able to like take that step back and reevaluate, like, is this still the best way I can do this? I think is a really great skill for staying on top of the game and kind of innovating the top end of it. So with Gratmus coming out in December, like we got 20 something new detachments, all the game shifted. We got a balance update, and now we're getting new codexes. So the game is like in this big period of change and flux, and we're starting to get our grips on the meta again. But where did you think the meta was going to be after all that shakeup, and how did you kind of decide on this list being a good fit for the meta?
Yeah, so with Grotmiss, I kind of made my peace with the fact that I wasn't entirely sure where the meta was going to be. And so instead of building a list that was trying to counter what was currently in the meta, I decided I would rather build a list for John. I built a list to give myself as many options as possible because there's 50 things that I could play against, but there's, 5 to 9 things that I will play against. And I'd rather just solve that at the table and make sure that I have my options open when I get there. That's something that I really like. That's something that I thought that my Vanguard did really well at the previous World Championships. And I felt like the lack of options that I had with Guard at Worlds really made me sad. And so I was very much after Worlds, after, losing on the top table, I left that tournament, went into Thanksgiving and, the Christmas holidays, really thinking about how I wanted more choices at the table.
Mm-hmm. You wanted to basically have a more dynamic army than one that is pinned into a game plan, even if it's very good at it.
Absolutely. Because once I fumble that game plan or the game plan is fumbled for me, I'm kind of out of plans.
Yeah.
And I don't like that.
Now, that's a great way to kind of leverage your player skill at the table, being able to put the emphasis for you to do well as opposed to your list to carry you to do well. But it seems like your list is super strong and you obviously know how to pilot it really well. And that's the winning combination right there. John, why don't you just break down, kind of reading off top to bottom, what your list is?
Absolutely. So I start this Ultramarine list off with 2 characters, Guilliman and Marneus Calgar. Calgar is going to end up attached to a unit of company heroes. Then I have 1 Intercessor squad as my only battle line. After that, I have a little bit of a mixed bag, a bunch of one-off Space Marine units. I have 5 Infiltrators, 5 Incursors, 5 Scouts, and 3 Outriders. Just a bunch of one-off useful Space Marine units that all have a job to do. And I just close the list out with 6 vehicles, and that's it. I just have 2 Ballistus Dreadnoughts. They're cheap and cheerful. 1 Brutalis Dreadnought. He's my special combat boy. Just a little bit of extra counterpunch I really liked. 2 Storm Speeder Hammerstrikes, and a Storm Raven gunship.
Wait a minute. We got a Storm Raven up in here?
There's a Storm Raven up in here.
I love that, John. I absolutely love that. And a Brutalis. I don't think anyone has run the Brutalis in the history of 10th edition.
I have to ask the stat people if a Brutalis has won a tournament yet.
Well, it has now.
It has now, but I'm not sure if it had before.
That's spectacular. John, in your words, what is the strategy of this army? What's it trying to do?
Absolutely. So this is trying to play 5 turns of Warhammer. I think that is what Space Marines do best, is that they are jack of all trades. They're not the best army in the game at anything. They're not the best shooting army in the game. They're not the fastest army in the game. They're not the toughest army in the game. They're the hardest hitting combat army in the game. I can point at, Guard or World Leaders or Custodes or any army to do one thing better than Space Marines. But Space Marines are firmly an A at all of those. They are above average at everything I just listed. So what I'm trying to do with Space Marines, my game plan always going in, is I would like to play 5 turns of Warhammer with my opponent. I would like us to trade back and forth. I don't want this game to be decided on bottom of 1 by a shooting phase before the entire wall is called. I want to score points. I want to score primary. I want to contest primary. I just want to play 5 turns of Warhammer against my opponent. I really want my list to get this game into John versus opponent, not Space Marines versus Orcs.
Okay, I like that as a very interesting, unique answer to that question, right? Like you're trying to just let your army play Warhammer, and then you have to play it well from there. I imagine it leads to a lot of situational nuances, which we'll cover deeply in part 2. But on a broad level, how do you leverage playing 5 turns of Warhammer, and how do you put people into that spot?
Absolutely. The best way that I find to do that is to have a really big hammer and then some tricks. I have a really big hammer. If someone wants to run at me, I can shoot 2,000 points of Space Marines buffed by Guilliman at them. Most people who have experienced that once do not wish to experience it a second time. If you've ever been shot by Ultramarines, you know it hits really hard. I get 2 targets that I pick. My entire army gets reroll hits against them. Then I get +1 wound against them. I happen to have included a fair number of twin-linked weapons. I have a lot of guns. I have a decent amount of combat. If you let me tee off on you, it's going to hurt. So the first step is to make sure people don't want to rush me. Then I just got to start playing the objectives. I have infiltrating screens. I have scouting screens. I have fast-moving contesting pieces like Outriders. I have a little bit of everything. And a lot of guns and damage behind it. And so my goal is to leverage the cheap units to screen to get me to the middle of the game without us having a decisive turn 1. And then, well, I'm going to try to use these cheap units to draw you out piece by piece. Ideally 2 units at a time, so that I can oath both of them, snap my fingers, make them disappear from the face of the earth, and ask you to send 2 more units out.
Yeah, that research bleed can definitely become very taxing on somebody. I don't totally see how you have no problem with the hammer. Double Ballistus, double Hammerstrike, Storm Raven, that is firepower. In melee, you got Guilliman, Calgar, and Brutalis. You kind of got the whole package. In terms of early game skirmishing to get the game going, you have Outriders, Incursors, Infiltrators, and Scouts.
Yeah.
Only 4 units. How do you prolong that trade game while you're trying to do things like play the primary, get area denial, do containment, this, that, whatever, and your opponent presumably also has trade resources designed to do that are cheaper than yours?
Absolutely. So this comes down to 2 factors, really, which is in that early trade game, I need to make sure I never lose more than I gain. And I actually don't value 2 points of secondaries on turn 1 that highly. The way I see it is if I'm trying to play 5 turns of Warhammer, 2 points on turn 1 is probably not going to be the breakpoint. So I never trade something like a Scout Squad for Cleanse. If I just have Cleanse, now maybe if I have Area Denial, Extend Battle Lines, maybe I'd send out a Scout Squad. That's 10 secondary points. But to me, a Scout Squad that's alive is more important than, a 2-point Cleanse or Engage and a dead Scout Squad. And then there's the other aspect, which is that I'm trying to, at all points, make it not worth my opponent's time. I know we'll talk about some specifics in part 2, but for example, if I can poke out an Incursor squad to touch an objective, and I look at my opponent's army, and I figure out, okay, if my opponent wants to kill these Incursors, these are the 1 or 2 ways that they can do it in. If I can make sure that it's not worth their time. For example, the only thing that can kill this Incursor squad is a Dreadnought. If you send out a Dreadnought, it's going to get shot to death. Is that a trade you, Mr. Grey Knight opponent, would like to play? Maybe not.
And you also have the reactive move and Armor of Contempt axis. So if I trade like a small skirmishing unit, something appropriate to trade into 5 Incursors, it probably won't work for me.
Absolutely. Space Marines are really good at one-on-one interactions. If I'm 1 unit is hitting your 1 unit, I have Oath a Moment. If your 1 unit is hitting my 1 unit, I can pop Smoke and, pop Armor Contempt. I actually had a lot of the Phobos-y units in there. Scouts, like Infiltrators. There's a couple units in there that have the Smoke keyword and can pop Armor of Contempt. I have CP in spades. I'm playing Guilliman and Calgar. If you just have 1 unit go out and try it, I'll just throw 2 CP away. One of it's free, one of it I'll spend for, that's fine. If I have 1 or 2 Incursors left, they're probably behind a wall. If you tried to run at me and hit me with a combat unit, I'll react and move backwards. I'm trying to be as difficult to interact with as possible, force people to overcommit, and then have a large enough counterstrike to wipe out anything that they overextend.
I know you've come on the show before, and one of the questions I like to ask people on their first or second time on the show is to describe their play style and how their army kind of jives with that. And I know you love this, bring them in and then hit them very hard, counter-strike approach. Sometimes in Warhammer, you have situations that you can't control, like your opponent has bottom of turn in a mission that really rewards that, or maybe you just draw bad cards and the game is kind of getting away from you, so you need to make some stuff happen on the table. Now you have to go to your opponent, allow them to maybe hit you in the face, and you figure it out from there. How does your army shift from this plan A of reactive, draw them out and kill them, to a plan B, I need to go towards them and figure it out from there?
Absolutely. So there's 2 things to point out. 1, I'm really good at plan A. Because I have so many CP and free stratagems, I have a policy of there are 2 turns. There is a turn where I'm activating my entire army into my opponent's army, and there are turns where I discard every bad card I draw immediately. If I'm not activating my entire army into your whole army and I draw a card that I'm not scoring, I'm getting rid of it. It's not, it's turn 1, I don't want to spend a CP. Nope, it's gone.
Yeah, and that's because you have the free CP in spades.
I get 15 CP across the game from 10 for the game, 5 for Calgar, who I will often keep alive, and then I get a free stratagem every player turn from Guilliman. So I have, give or take, 20 plus command points to spend.
Yeah.
It's rare that I get perfect efficiency out of the Guilliman spend. Of course, you don't get it if you go second, but I can usually spend 22, 24 command points in a game.
That's a lot. I mean, at that point, you can cycle a card 5 times, use Armor of Contempt 5 times, and still have 12 CP to play the game with.
Yeah, that's usually what I do.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So you're basically putting your opponent on a scoring clock because you're just going to see more better cards than they are in your Space Marines.
Absolutely. So very good at plan A. That does not mean that plan A always works, though. As I mentioned, I do like having options and a backup plan. After that, the army is very fast. I believe that Warhammer right now, no one can make a game plan around reliably, not even Custodes, reliably taking the first hit and being okay with it. Bridgehead hits too hard. There's too many armies out there, like other Ultramarines, that hit so hard that if I'm just walking into their teeth and saying, take your best shot, I'm a Space Marine, I'm going to have my teeth knocked in. So I'm trying to cross the gap as fast as possible. I have actually pretty good defense in this detachment. In addition to general Space Marines and Armor of Contempt access, I have a 1 command point stratagem to get -1 to hit and wound and shooting on one of my flying vehicles or my mounted. And I'm also very fast because my entire army can advance and charge. If I have to cross the gap, I can usually count on waiting until I rapid ingress and then pushing very hard, very fast at that point. Because in a pinch, I can tell my Storm Raven to move a flat 26 inches, then shoot and charge.
Holy Bojangles.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fast, Sean. That's very fast.
So if I need to cross the gap, I'll do it in 1 turn. I'm not going to let you take a swing on me in the middle of it.
If you are listening to this, it probably means you play Warhammer 40k. And if you're playing Warhammer, you know you need a lot of dice. Baron of Dice is where we get our dice from. They produce amazing different kinds of dice. We just recently got all kinds of different faction dice shipped to us, which we use on our stream games. But not only do they look really cool, but they're highly customizable. You can get different symbols, corners that are square, corners that are round, different shapes and sizes, different sided dice. It's all the rage. And they're customizable in color and design as well. They are so cool looking. Not only that, but they feel great to roll in your hands. I've never held dice that roll and feel this good. Not only that, but they are scientifically perfectly balanced. There are tons of case studies on people rolling thousands of dice and recording all the results that they get. And sometimes you might get a die that rolls just a few too many ones. We've all had to throw it out before. These dice are not like that. They are perfectly balanced to a T, thousands of rolls, perfect distribution. If you want to take your Warhammer game seriously and make sure the dice are not screwing you over, get some Baron of dice.
Okay, so you have burst speed as needed to cross the gap really quickly if it comes to that. But obviously that's kind of plan B. Plan A is to draw them towards you and then win trades and then hit them very hard with your superior stats, basically. When you're doing all this, you're scoring secondaries really nicely. And you're cycling cards well. How are you fighting over primary? Because I imagine this type of play with like 1 scout squad at a time for the early game doesn't lend itself to putting like a bunch of OC on midfield objectives.
Yeah, so my general policy is that me and my opponent get to have the same primary early game, and they get to decide if we both get 10s or we both get 5s. If my opponent, all I try to do is set up positive trades, where I'm going to put something like an Infiltrator squad or an Incursor squad on an objective. In Pariah Nexus, it is not unlikely on the GW terrain that you can put some of your models on an objective and have it be behind a wall. But that doesn't work all the time. And so the goal is that if it's a board where I can't do that without getting shot, then by that logic, my opponent also cannot do that without getting shot. And if I can, then they can. And so as long as we're trading even on primary early game, I'm okay if it's 5s for both of us or 10s for both of us. Doesn't bother me either way. What I am looking to do is to make them spend resources to preserve their side. Because my army is so fast, and I usually put a decent amount of reserves, I can often place people on the back foot. And if they want to be aggressive towards me, then I activate an Ultramarine army with double oath, and I hope that clears them in time for me to score points.
So let me make sure I got this. Basically, you and your opponent are mirroring primary early, and that's because if the objectives are in the open, neither of you will hold it, or if they're behind terrain, you can both hold it. Easy stuff. But then from there, you're trying to create a material advantage through the trade war, which lets you then leverage your material advantage into more points late game.
Exactly. And if I need to, because I am so fast, I can send out 1 piece at a time to go make an important primary play. Between me having infiltrators and reactive moves, it is often very difficult for my opponent to arrive and push onto my objectives. But I usually have things in Deep Strike that are very fast. And it's like a Storm Speeder. Storm Speeder can rapid ingress with Deep Strike and then move 20 inches. And so it is very difficult to keep that off of your objectives.
So you're kind of going very far with those things potentially.
Absolutely.
And like going deep into like their backfield, what normally is safe in a normal game of Warhammer.
Normally safe, not necessarily so. And especially things like that Outrider unit, if I use the stratagem, they just move 21 inches.
That's pretty good.
They're OC2 each.
And then they shoot and then they charge.
Yeah, and with 6 OC, it's not that hard. We get to that nice standoff zone. There's a big no man's land. I've got a 10, you've got a 10. It looks like we're going to be doing that for a turn. An Outrider squad goes 21 inches around a wall. I don't go through, but 21 inches.
Yeah.
And I just go, I don't even charge you. I just tap your objective and say, all right, 6 OC on it, you get a 5. Are you going to send something at me? If you send at me, I react and move back so that I don't lose the piece. I may lose the objective for a turn, but I don't lose the piece. And then I kill your piece and move back onto it.
So this kind of is a great segue into your eclectic pile of Space Marine one-ofs. Usually with an army like any army, you kind of identify the best data sheets of the jobs you're trying to do, and you take like 2 or 3 of them because you're very efficient at it, and now you have redundancy. With a bunch of one-ups, obviously you have a wider tool bag of more things you can accomplish, but you're a little more vulnerable to like your opponent shot your Outriders, now you have no Outriders or something like that. Why did you land on this specific set of units? And there are tons of units to choose from in Space Marines. And then how do you manage just one of each of them?
Yeah, so I think that this army works well because, frankly, due to my profession, I'm very comfortable with where Warhammer is at any given point. I think this army works really well if you know what your opponent is doing. And I'm a curious person. I also ask a lot of questions when I get to the table. So this take one of everything relies on looking at your opponent's army, realizing which 2 of your 4 disposable pieces is the most valuable, and making sure that's not the one that gets lost early. If I'm looking and I'm realizing, okay, my opponent doesn't have a lot of screens, suddenly my scouts are more valuable than my Outriders because my scouts on turn 3, 4, 5 can live in my opponent's backfield. And sometimes I'm looking, my opponent doesn't have a lot of OC. And that's where the Outriders get really valuable because that's 6 OC to go contest objective and go very far. Sometimes my opponent has a lot of reserves. The Infiltrators are more important. This trend continues. And so I have to look at my opponent's army and kind of make a decision which units are sacrificial and which units are going to be really important. And is that importance, is it a one-use importance like Outriders and Incursors, or is it a game-long importance like, Infiltrators and Scouts?
So it's like they all kind of fit the same job of this is a cheap skirmish piece, and then you have 4 of those. Beyond that, they have a specialized job within cheap skirmish piece.
Exactly, and I get to the table, I read my opponent's list and the mission, and I figure out which piece is going to be how valuable in each game.
I really like that approach. Is that something that you do pretty much only with Marines because of their depth of data sheets, or is this something you apply to all of your factions?
I try to apply it to all of my factions, but I will say that Marines do it better than most.
Yeah, I'm trying to sit in my Gene Steer Cult army with like 10 data sheets total, and I'm like, I don't know if I can do that one.
Yeah, Space Marines have a little bit of a privileged position in there.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, John, I have a few more questions for you before we hop over into part 2. You said you reserve a lot, and it sounds like this army is very dynamic and plays the opponent, so I don't want to get too deep into part 2 with this part 1 question, but what is like a typical deployment for you?
So a typical deployment is that I have Guilliman and Calgar stapled together at the hip in the most forward ruin possible. Intercessors deploy on my back objective. And then I have Infiltrators and Scouts that are outside of my deployment zone, but generally far from the opponent. I do not want to get hit early and lose a piece that I am not planning on. I don't have spare pieces here.
Like all behind terrain, pretty much?
Yeah, or in range to scout behind terrain. Mm-hmm. Then I have my Incursor squad, or in some previous versions I had Reavers, but now they're Incursors. They usually deploy on the line within 9 inches of the Stormraven, who is behind a wall in the safe spot. There is typically only 1 or 2 safe spots for the Stormraven in my deployment zone, and it's just where it goes. I actually try to put my my Incursors there in case I want to like scout backwards into the Raven.
Oh, because you can scout into the Raven.
You can scout into the Raven. And if I go first, I can scout forward and start getting upfield, but if I go second, I'll just scout backwards and get in the Raven.
Sure.
And then I put a Ballistus Dreadnought inside the Raven. Not the Brutalis, a Ballistus.
Interesting. So you have 1 Ballistus just walking around on foot and 1 Ballistus like in there?
Usually reserves.
Usually reserve a Ballistus.
Usually reserve a Ballistus. And then the Brutalis deploys way further back than anyone expects because it's going to hop in the Stormraven in a second.
Why do you start 1 Ballistus in the Raven if you're going to get the Brutalis in instantly?
It's because I want the extra movement early game. So 1, I can disembark from the Stormraven and just be 3 inches further forward than I would have been. Mm-hmm. 2, I can normal move the Stormraven and then disembark the Ballistus.
Right. Then it's a 20
at that point, this 23-inch turn 1 normal move on the Ballistus.
Yeah.
And at that point, you get some really fun firing lanes with 23 inches of movement.
And if you're doing that, though, your Ballistus, I imagine, or sorry, your Brutalis is not hopping into the Raven if the Raven jets off 20
At that point,
inches.
no. But usually what happens is once I point out to my opponent, hey, I can disembark this Ballistus 23 inches from its current location. Have fun.
Yeah.
Usually people take that as a sign to be more conservative, not less so. And so if I don't need to, I will then just get the Ballistus out, turn 1, get the Brutalis in, and start driving around. But you have a lot of potential threats, and I have a lot of choices. And so game to game, I'm going to choose which one. And worst case scenario, I actually make good on my threats and I don't get the Brutalis in. He's just going to start advancing straight towards the front line. And he'll hide behind terrain as he goes. He'll be smart about it. But generally, with advance and charge, he's fast enough.
Yeah.
Because I'm not using him aggressively. He's mostly there so people don't push me.
Yeah, he's a countercharge piece.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. So you actually have 3 big melee threats for countercharge. Guilliman, Calgar, and the Brutalis.
Very important in the mirror because I have one more than they do.
I suppose that's true. I wasn't thinking about the Stormlance Ultramarine mirror, but maybe I should be now.
Well, the Gladius mirror is more specific.
Yes. Okay. So you didn't mention your Hammerstrikes at all in this deployment. I'm still curious about the reserving of the 1 Ballistus.
Yeah, I usually reserve 1 Ballistus, 1 Hammerstrike, and then I'll put 1 Hammerstrike on the table. So usually I'll just hide that behind terrain. It flies, it's fast. Compared to a normal Space Marine parking lot, if you hear 6 Space Marine vehicles, you think of a parking lot. 3 of my 6 can fly. I put some in reserves, and then 1 of the 3 that can't fly at any point is inside the Storm Raven, so it totally does get to fly.
Yeah,
so
and not just like fly the keyword, fly 20 inches.
Yeah, not just fly, it flies.
Yeah.
and 20 inches is a common number in my list somehow. And so this does not logjam in the way a normal Space Marine armor list does.
I think that's a huge boon to it because you have all of that offensive firepower and defense brought to you by Space Marine vehicles and Oath, but you don't suffer the standard, like, oops, I got jailed with my 3 Vindicators, 3 Predators style list.
Absolutely. If you've been following Space Marines for a while, you might notice that every time there is a good infantry Space Marine shooting unit, GW nerfs it. They have been doing this all edition long. And at a certain point, I threw my hands in the air and said, fine, I'll use tanks to shoot people. Centurions went up, Eradicators went up, Fire Discipline got nerfed, Desolators went up. Like every time, just hammer, hammer, hammer. The points go up, the rules go down. I'm done. They want me to use tanks to shoot people, I will use tanks to shoot people.
It seems to be working. Okay, so we've got this very flexible deployment with like a Hammerstrike and Ballistus in reserve. Why not just put more vehicles on the table and then like kind of march of the Ancients up the board?
I really like that my list actually condenses down into a very small profile very easily. And because it's so fast, if you try to hide an armored list, it's so far back that it struggles to get upfield. Mine does not. They may be a little more fragile point for point than, an average tank, right? But like a Hammerstrike is more fragile than a Predator.
Yeah.
But it's okay because I am faster and I'm not going to get shot turn 1, and I can be useful from a position of not being shot still.
And then things like your Storm Raven are inherently -1 damage, so they're not even easy to kill if you do get a line to it.
Yeah, and if someone wants to overextend to take 1 shot, I have enough CP to use defensive stratagems and not feel bad about it, and I have some pretty good defensive stratagems to let 1 thing be a lot more durable than it looks like. If you get to tee off your entire army on my entire army, you're going to find several vehicles that are, in fact, having no buffs at all, and they die, like Space Marine. But if you can only hit 1 thing at a time, well, that's the thing that's getting Armor of Contempt and Smoke and -1 to hit and wound or whatever.
Yeah. So the Storm Raven and the whole army can kind of condense its deployment to hide really effectively. And usually that means you're further back. But in your case, because your army moves 20, shoots and advances and charges, it doesn't really care that it's so far back. It can still just get itself activated in the game. And then because you have reserves, you can use things like long-range reserve angles or rapid ingress to open up dynamic plays to open up the game as needed in later turns.
Absolutely.
Sounds awesome. Okay, John, I love this army. I think it's really cool. It's a really beautiful thing you've created here that I don't think anyone else I've seen running it. I have one question for you before we hop in part 2 and see how you actually pilot this game against real players at Warzone Atlanta. If you had a piece of advice you could give an aspiring Warhammer player, what would it be?
If I were to give one piece of advice to someone who's aspiring to Warhammer in general,
Trying to get better, yeah.
trying to get better, trying to be more competitive, okay, here it is. Find people who are as good or better than you. It's much faster to get better when you play against, tough competition, when you challenge yourself. And it's okay to challenge yourself, and it's okay if you lose while challenging yourself. Don't settle for safe. If you find that you beat someone, don't always play them because you enjoy winning more than losing. You're going to stay at that level.
Yeah, I think that's very, very sound advice. Do you have any suggestions on how someone who's maybe newer to the scene could find people to play against that are better than them?
It all starts with local communities, be that finding out what events are near you and trying to sign up. When you get to an event, even if it's just a local RTT or a local comic book store that sells Warhammer, asking questions. It is a social game at the end of the day, but almost every local community at this point in just about every country is going to have either a Facebook page or a Discord channel or a tournament league. And you know what? Failing all of that, these resources exist online as well with big TTS leagues. And as you meet gamers, there's one thing that I promise you about every 40K player. We all like talking about 40K.
That's true.
So when you find a 40K player, someone, you gel with a little bit, someone that maybe you want to be their friend, ask them about Warhammer, they're going to want to talk about it. You can go far with that.
Awesome, John. That was a spectacular answer. Folks, if you want more John, more talking about Space Marines, check us out on our podcast, Patreon, patreon.com/AOW40K. You get access to this episode's part 2, where we're going to talk about all of John's games. You get access to our Discord server. And a new feature of our Discord server is that we are going to be running Art of War TTS leagues moving on starting in February. So if you're looking to build that community, find players who are better than you and play games to get better yourself, this is a great opportunity to do it. It's open to all of our Discord members. You can become a Discord member by subscribing to our Patreon. It supports the show, gets you access to more episodes, gets you access to our Discord server. It's a no-brainer. Thanks so much for coming on the show, John.
Thank you.
We'll catch you next week, everybody.
Like what you just listened to? Check out Art of War Down Under and Art of War Unbroken on the competitive 40K network. TheArtofWar40K.com.